On a cold February night in 1978, 5 young men with disabilities living in California mysteriously disappeared. Normally, they were supposed to participate in a disabled basketball tournament the next day. They had even prepared their uniforms the night before. However, none of them would return home that night. Worse still, no one would be able to make sense of what I am about to tell you. First of all, these 5 young men were close friends and sports enthusiasts living around Yuba City, California. Their families described them as individuals with disabilities. 2 of them, Ted Weiher and Jack Hewitt, were diagnosed with mild intellectual disabilities. The other 2, Bill Sterling and Jack Madruga, were described as people with learning disabilities. They had some cognitive delays. Gary Mathias, on the other hand, was a former soldier who had served in the army. However, due to issues he experienced while serving in Germany, he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and began receiving psychiatric treatment. Unlike the others, his condition was not congenital, or at least it hadn't manifested earlier. Still, he was not in a great place psychiatrically. Fortunately, by 1978, he had started taking his medication regularly, and was even praised by his doctors as one of their most successful cases. So yes, all 5 had their own mental disabilities or disorders, but this by no means meant they were disconnected from life. The 5 friends would spend their free time playing or watching basketball together. They played for a team called the Gateway Gators in a rehabilitation program established for disabled individuals in Yuba. Additionally, each lived with their family and worked in various jobs. Some did gardening, while others held blue-collar jobs like dishwashing in restaurants or janitorial work. In short, they weren't people who could just be dismissed as mentally disabled and unable to care for themselves. On the contrary, they were active individuals in society with complementary skills. When the calendar showed Friday, February 24, 1978, these young men had only one thing on their minds: the basketball game to be played the next day. On February 25th, this quintet was going to play their first match in a tournament with the Gateway Gators, and if they won this tournament for special individuals, they would earn a week-long vacation in Los Angeles as a prize. Their excitement was so great that they had prepared their uniforms and shoes the night before. Their families knew very well that their sons would not want to miss this game. For this reason, that Friday evening, the 5 friends made a small plan to boost their morale for the next day's game. They would go to the city of Chico, about 80 kilometers away, and watch an intercollegiate basketball game there. They would both wander around a bit and follow the sport they loved. 2 people in the group had driver's licenses, Gary Mathias and Jack Madruga. That evening, Jack would take the wheel of his 1969 model car. Around 6:30 p.m. on February 24, 1978, they set off from Yuba City. After a relatively short journey of about 80 kilometers, they arrived at the stadium. The night started quite well for the 5 friends. A nice trip, followed by a good game, their team's victory, and at 10 p.m., it was time for the journey home. Before leaving Chico, just as it was closing, they stopped at a market in the center. Because they arrived at closing time, they received some attitude from the cashier, but they bought snacks for the road, turned up the music, and the journey home began. Unfortunately, that cashier would be the last person to see those 5 young men. The youths would get into their car, set off, and vanish into the darkness. They were unaware that they were being seen alive for the last time. In fact, after getting their snacks from Chico that night, the 5 friends should have gotten their car and headed home to Yuba City. Normally, the route they would follow was about a 1-hour drive. However, when the next morning came, it was noticed that none of the 5 friends had returned home and their car was nowhere to be found. Consequently, all the families called each other in a short time, and when it was understood that no one was there, the police were informed. However, for the first 24 hours in missing person cases, it wasn't seen as an urgent situation for adult individuals. Therefore, the police calmed the families down with the idea that they just got caught up in wandering around. But when evening came and no one returned or made any communication, official missing person reports were taken. Search teams began scanning the main road route the youths might have used while returning home from Chico. For the first few days, no trace of the missing men was found. It was as if they had vanished into thin air along with the car. However, on February 28, 1978, an interesting coincidence occurred. That day, a forest ranger from the nearby county's Forest Service realized that an abandoned car he had seen on patrol a few days earlier was the same as the missing youth's car advertised in the newspaper, and informed the police. This should have been good news, But there was a problem. Yes, the vehicle was indeed that of the youths. The only difference was that the vehicle the rangers saw was in a completely different direction from Chico. It was in a mountainous area to the northeast, on a lonely roadside in Plumas National Forest. This location had nothing to do with Chico or Yuba County, where the youths' homes were. It was in a completely different direction. Therefore, although finding the vehicle was initially encouraging, it made things even more mysterious. The road where it was found was a winding, dirt forest road that was usually closed by snow in winter. If the vehicle had gone a bit further, it would likely have encountered a snow barrier where it couldn't proceed. Anyway, what was the point? How did they get there? It was a complete mystery. Even the families thought it was absolutely impossible for their sons to stray into the mountains and wilderness for leisure. In fact, Jack's mother would specifically state several times that Jack hated the cold. But now the important thing was a detailed investigation and following the clues. First of all, the doors of the car by the roadside were not locked. Even one window was halfway open. But there was no sign of a human around. There was nothing strange around the vehicle. The car was in a non-running state, but it had no mechanical failure. When the police couldn't find the ignition key, they started the engine with a single turn by hot wiring it. And there was about a quarter tank of gas in the tank. So, in light of all the information, technically this car was in a condition to continue on its way or get out of half an inch of snow with a very light push, even though it didn't have snow tires. After all, there were 5 adult men. It should have been possible in the car. There were also small clues inside the car that confirmed the story, like the brochures for the basketball game in Chico lying on the front seats. This meant they had gone to the game. Additionally, wrappers for the food they bought from the market, empty soda bottles, candy wrappers, and milk cartons were also in the car. Besides this, an unopened map was in the glove compartment, so they had road maps in their hands and hadn't felt the need to use them. Yet, interestingly, the car keys were nowhere to be found. In this scenario, the logic that the car broke down and they went to get help could have worked, but neither the door was locked nor the window closed. Therefore, this theory would be absurd. Moreover, the car was in working condition. It seemed to have no deficiency. When there were so many confusions like this, the teams initially didn't know what to do or where to start. But one way or another, these efforts had to continue. Just as a heavy search and rescue operation was about to start in the area after the vehicle was found, a serious snowstorm began, and 25 to 30 centimeters of new snow fell. Consequently, any traces that might have existed were unfortunately completely buried under the snow. Due to the heavy snow falling in the mountainous region, search and rescue operations became impossible. Although officials tried to advance and conduct search operations for 2 days, they were stopped until further notice when they themselves faced the danger of getting lost. While there was no trace or idea regarding the 5 men, finding them had also approached the impossible. When the news started to come out, the police received several tip-off calls, but most of the tips received were either baseless or inconsistent. Time was passing. The 5 were still not found, and anyway, while the forest was buried in snow, finding them would only happen with the change of season, when the snow melted. It was not possible to hear from the men until winter ended and the spring sun melted the snow in the mountains. Although the police and teams expanded the search, scanned the forest roads, and conducted reconnaissance with helicopters, there was no result. Until June 1978, towards the end of spring, when the snow melted, those who went for a walk in the forest would make a very painful discovery. On June 4, 1978, a group of young people who came to the area for off-road riding with their motorcycles reached a Forest Service campsite deep in the Plumas forest. This was a campsite used by firefighters and foresters in the summers at the top of the mountains, which stood empty in the winter. However, contrary to what was normal, it was understood that it had not stood empty that winter, because one of the youths saw a broken window in the camp container, looked inside, noticed a decomposed human body, and informed the police. This thing found was the remains of Ted Weiher, the eldest of the 5 missing friends. This news, coming exactly 3.5 months later, unfortunately meant the end of hope. When Ted's lifeless body was examined by the teams, the situation was dire. Only a 40-kilogram body remained of a 32-year-old man, about 180 centimeters tall and weighing 90 kilograms. More interestingly, while he was lying on his back in the narrow bed in the single room of the trailer, his body was covered from head to toe with 8 layers of sheets, even wrapped as if swaddled. According to what was told, the condition in which Ted was found was one in which he could not have wrapped himself like that alone. According to the autopsy results, The cause of death was starvation and hypothermia. When he passed away, he had only a thin t-shirt and pants on. He had no shoes. He was lying in his socks. Most interestingly and sadly, the man's beard had grown considerably. According to the information given by his family, he had shaved before leaving home, and it was estimated that the beard could only grow that way over 8 to 13 weeks. So Ted had stayed alive for about 10 weeks. Indeed, the fact that he lost more than half of his body weight was a sign that he had been starving for weeks. So, if he could have been reached a few weeks earlier, he would likely have been found alive. Well, if Ted was alive for all that time, where were the others? Why hadn't they done something to save Ted? Well, unfortunately, the answer to that question came in the following days. After Ted was found, searches between the container and the point where the car was found were intensified. Thus, it didn't take long to find new remains belonging to two people by the side of the forest road, in the middle of the 20-kilometer distance. These belonged to Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling. The bodies of both were mutilated by wild animals. Forensic teams examining the bones would determine that both died of hypothermia and that this was likely on the night they disappeared or within that few-day period. Perhaps one gave up first, the other didn't leave his side, and unfortunately, he met the same fate. 2 days after them, on June 7th, the youngest member of the five, Jack Hewitt, was found, and unfortunately, the person who found him was Jack's own father. Jack was also found in the forest about 3 kilometers from the container. Although I say found, as I explained, none of these findings were in a single whole piece. It was realized they were the ones by gathering remains in a circle of about 10, 20, or even 50 meters. Of course, in line with the examinations, he too had lost his life due to hypothermia. Thus, the clearest result from these sequentially found remains was that each of them froze to death on the mountain. But still, the fifth person, Gary Mathias, was nowhere to be found. No matter how hard the search teams tried, not the slightest trace of Gary's body could be found. There were some noteworthy finds near the container. For example, about 400 meters away from the container by the roadside, 3 wool blankets belonging to forest officials and a flashlight were found. Even the switch of the flashlight was off, but it wouldn't be understood who left it or when it was left. The most interesting finding was inside the container, because the sneakers of Gary, who was diagnosed with schizophrenia and could not be found dead or alive, were also found inside that container. They were by the side of the bed where Ted was lying, but there was no shoe on Ted's feet. Therefore, a result had emerged. Maybe Gary reached the container with Ted, Gary's shoes got wet, etc., and he wore Ted's and went to seek help. If so, Gary would never be able to return again. This matter would remain one of the biggest mysteries of the quintet case and still could not be solved. But the real biggest mystery and the creepy part was again on the container side. Especially this Forest Service container was technically a shelter full of life materials for emergencies, and was the best place you could stay if you were to be stranded on that mountain. A warehouse full of plenty of provisions. There were food boxes called sea rations used by the American Army. Indeed, in the examination conducted around the trailer where Ted was found, it was determined that 36 cans had been opened and eaten. So this meant Ted and probably Gary discovered and consumed those cans to avoid starving after taking refuge here. Moreover, there was enough food stock for another year. Additionally, in the kitchen part of the container, there was a stove connected to the propane tank outside and a valve that operated the heating system. So if just one valve were opened, the inside would be both warm and they would have a working stove. When the teams came and checked, they determined that both the valve and the heating system, as well as the tank, were full and in working order, so nothing was missing. They could have lived there comfortably for months. Furthermore, let's say nothing happened and didn't work. Inside there were dozens of matches, wood ready to be burned, and furniture, chairs as well. While they had already found the food, if they were afraid of freezing, they could have burned them and warmed up. But they hadn't done this either. It was unbelievable. In short, while everything you could look for to save a life was present, not a single match had been struck. No fire had been lit in the stove. Therefore, this situation had infuriated the investigators and the families, just like me and even you. But that was the situation. What had happened to the five? Why had they stopped? Why had they taken the wrong road? Why had they separated? There were dozens of questions like these. Since Gary couldn't be found, his photos were distributed to nearby mental hospitals with the thought that maybe he had descended to civilization in a state of mental instability. But no, the man would never appear. That was the situation. If you have an opinion, I am dying to read your comments, because I couldn't make any logical deduction in this story. Never mind those who couldn't reach the container. But Ted's death and Gary not being found were not logical at all. Actually, there were many illogical things. Did someone force and deceive them? Why did they leave the car there when it was in movable condition? For example, okay, they left it. Why did they walk further forward instead of walking back the way they came? There are dozens of questions for you, such as how Ted died of starvation in a place full of food. The official investigation is still open. Since there were no signs of battery on the men, Gary couldn't be found, and a full deduction couldn't be made. The file hasn't been closed. In police records, it has remained as a mysterious disappearance and death event. Honestly, I couldn't wrap my head around it. See you in the comments.